Today, we return once again to the plagues of Egypt. Last year, in considering the plagues, we focused upon their purposes and their messages. And while I'll note those messages for the purposes of our discussion today, our focus is rather on their ramifications. We can, over the course of the plagues, the introduction to them, and the various introductions and aftermaths of the plagues, identify a number of discrete lessons that, as conveyed by Moses from God, Pharaoh, and of course ultimately we and all the world are supposed to learn from the plagues. Inevitably, the message ultimately is going to be transformational for the world. The general message with which the whole enterprise of the plagues begins is the lesson expressed in Exodus chapter 7, verse 5, kind of general introduction. And the Egyptians shall know that I am God when I stretch forth my hand upon Egypt and bring out the children of Israel from among them. That message, knowing about God, obviously should not be construed to be anything of the sort of some egotistical despot who wants to impress people. We appreciate that knowing about God does nothing for God, but does everything for us. God represents absolute truth, absolute righteousness, absolute goodness, absolute justice. Knowing about God means knowing about that. Knowing that message that will impact upon our lives. And the whole story of the Exodus is intended to drive that point home. So this, of course, was a general introduction to the plagues altogether. We continue in chapter 7, in verse 17, this being specifically an introduction to the plague of blood. Thus says God, in this you shall know that I am God. In other words, the actualization of that general message that was the introduction to the plagues generally, with respect to the specific starting point of the plagues, plague number 1. When we continue in our progression, we readily appreciate that there is indeed a crescendo being expressed here, that is, in the wake of the plague of the frogs, plague number 2, and specifically Moses praying to God for their withdrawal. This is so that you may know that there is none like God our Lord. And continuing in this progression, in chapter 8, verse 18, in the prelude to the 4th plague, the plague of noxious creatures, wild beasts, the first plague that by its nature can have far more than merely local reach, we read, and we should pay attention to the point here. God says, and I shall set apart in that day the land of Goshen in which my people dwell, that no noxious creatures, wild beasts, will be there, to the end that you may know that I am God in the midst of the earth. Note, it is explicit from plague number 4, implicit with respect to them all, that a distinction is to be drawn between the Egyptians and the Israelites. The plague affects the perpetrators of the crimes, not their victims. But the message here still is explicitly theological, that you may know that I am God in the midst of the earth. Now, we continue into chapter 9. This is in the introduction to the plague of hail, that the message here, again, continuing in our crescendo, is, I will this time send all my plagues upon your person, and upon your servants, and upon your people, that you may know that there is none like me in all the earth. And indeed, further stressing the point that in very deed for this cause have I made you to stand, to show you my power, that my name may be declared throughout all the earth. Again, this is in the introduction to hail, plague number 7, in the aftermath of plague number 7, again in the context of Moses' praying for the plague to be withdrawn, verse 29, I will spread forth my hands unto God, the thunders shall cease, neither shall there be any more hail, that you may know that the earth is God's. And moving on to chapter 10, the introduction to the 8th plague, the plague of locust. Here, we should stress, the message overtly is directed to Israel. So the purpose of these plagues is so you may tell in the ears of your son and of your son's son. Either we could render the continuation as in the classic translation here, what I have wrought upon Egypt, or perhaps a better, more rigorous translation, how I made a mockery of Egypt, and my signs that I have done among them, that you may know that I am God. You, every you, the Egyptians, the Israelites, and all of humanity for all generations, to learn this message of God. So the progression, again, beginning with the general message of all the plagues, that Egypt will know that I am God, and progressing to the particularization progressively, that you will know that I am God, that you will know that there is none like God our Lord, that you will know that I am God in the midst of the earth, that you will know that there is none like me in all the earth, that you will know that all the earth is God's. A crescendo of making known the glory of God. Again, not to give God an ego trip, but to teach us that there is a divine source for all the world, to teach us that message of divinity. And that brings us to the final lesson, where the final lesson at the outset appears to be totally incongruous with everything we've seen until now in introducing the final plague, the 10th plague, the smiting of the firstborn. Chapter 11, Moses says to Pharaoh, beginning here in verse 4, thus says God, about midnight will I go out in the midst of Egypt, and all the firstborn in the land of Egypt will die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sits upon his throne, even to the firstborn of a maidservant that is behind the mill, and all the firstborn of cattle. And there will be a great cry throughout all the land of Egypt, such as has been none like it, nor shall be like it any more. But against any of the children of Israel shall not a dog growl, whine, sharpen its tongue, against man or beast, that you may know, final lesson, that God makes a distinction, puts a difference between the Egyptians and Israel. That you may know that. That's the high note of this crescendo. Again, it strikes us altogether as incongruous with everything we've seen until now. All of the previous lessons were what we could broadly describe as theological. They were teaching us about God. This isn't teaching us about God. This is teaching us about, how shall we describe this? A sociological distinction to be drawn between Egypt and Israel. It seems incongruous. It seems anticlimactic. It seems altogether out of character with what the progression of the plagues was intended to impart to us. That's the central problem that I'd like to address. That, of course, pertains directly to what we read here in chapter 11 of Exodus, verse 7. But in order to address this issue, I feel compelled to conjoin to it what we read at the beginning of chapter 12. What we read at the beginning of chapter 12, specifically, is a divine command. A command that is conveyed by God to Moses and Aaron to convey it in turn to the nation of Israel. This month shall be unto you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you. Now, there are a couple of points that I feel obliged to stress here. First is, you may be wondering why I am describing this as a command. It doesn't seem to be commanding anything. I should stress here that we are following a very ancient tradition in understanding the import of this verse as essentially the command to reckon time, to establish a calendar. All of the holy days of the cycle of the year, of course, hinge upon there being some calendar that tells us when the months are. We are being told here to reckon time. This month shall be unto you the beginning of months, the first month of the year. So this is establishing some structure for the calibration of time, and it is, like all commandments, a charge that God is conveying through Moses and Aaron to the nation. That's the first point of clarification. Second point of clarification is, this isn't just a commandment. This is the first commandment that God gives the emergent nation of Israel. Now, as you may be aware, in our tradition, we reckon in the Torah, in the 5 books of Moses, many commandments that God conveys to Israel. We have an ancient tradition that the sum total reckoning of the commandments is 613 in the 5 books of Moses. And mind you, I should note here that we only get to the count of 613 by restricting what gets included. Because if you were to include every place in the Torah, every place in the 5 books of Moses, where there is some kind of imperative that is conveyed by God to the world, the number would be astronomical. But of course, even 613 is certainly no trivial listing. And of the 613 commandments as we reckon them, just to engage in a quick overview of what we've seen in the Torah, in the 5 books of Moses thus far. In all of Genesis, we can reckon 3 such commandments. The first was God's command to Adam and Eve to be fruitful and multiply. A commandment to procreate that pertains by extension not only to Adam and Eve, but also their progeny. The second command is explicitly given to Abraham and to Abraham's seed after him to engage in the practice of circumcision of all males. The third is a commandment that is stated, if you will, matter-of-factly. After the conflict between Jacob and his anonymous assailant, who, as it emerges in the narrative, is an angel of God, back in Genesis chapter 32. And after describing the aftermath of the conflict, the dislocation of Jacob's thigh, we read of the prohibition on Israel, Jacob's progeny, eating the sciatic nerve, the thigh vein that is associated with the same part of the body where this dislocation, where this hobbling of Jacob took place. Now, I'm mentioning this merely by way of brief overview. There were 3 commands then in all of the book of Genesis, which means that from here on in, we only have another 610 to go. And this is the first of those 610. The first command, again, I stress, that is given to Israel as an emergent nation. The commands that pertain to Passover follow, of course, immediately afterward, but this is the first. And of course, inevitably, we are obliged to conjoin to the question we already raised with respect to Exodus chapter 11, verse 7. This question: why this? Why is this the first command? Why is this the first charge that God gives to his people as they emerge as a nation? I'd like to attempt to address this second question on 3 different levels, if you will, incrementally. And I think on each of these levels, besides attempting to understand wherein lies the significance of this commandment, we can additionally discern a progressively deeper answer to our first question. Again, why the high note of the crescendo of the plagues is peculiarly this. Again, that you may know how God puts a difference, makes a distinction between the Egyptians and Israel. So, without any further ado, let's begin with level number 1. Level number 1 pertains altogether to what really the conceptual thrust of this commandment is. Again, this month shall be unto you the beginning of months, the first month of the year to you. Why? why begin reckoning months from this month? Well, of course, your natural reaction is, that's a stupid question. It's pretty obvious. This is the month of the Exodus. This is the month of all these miracles, all these wonders wrought by God coming to their utmost culmination. God revealed in the world. That message is critically important to the world. And of course, you're right. That's the obvious answer to the question of why we are to reckon the year from this month, from the month of the Exodus. Because not only for Moses and Aaron, and not only for their contemporaries in the nation of Israel, but for all of us, for all time, we are to remember this message. We are to integrate the extent to which God was here, dramatically revealed in the world. And again, that's not for God's sake, that's for our sake. To integrate into our own lives that conviction that God is revealed in this world. In other words, in short, the message of Isaiah chapter 43, verse 21, the people that I formed for myself, that they might tell of my praise. Now, the context, we should note, of those words of Isaiah, when we consider the previous verse, is the realization that certainly the people that God formed, his people, the nation of Israel, is not the only entity, the only agent in making known God's presence and God's praises in the world. Verse 20, the beasts of the field will honor me, the jackals, the ostriches, because I give waters in the wilderness and rivers in the desert to give drink to my people, to my select. Everything and everyone should be retelling God's praises, declaring God's glory, because we all need to. We all need that message of divinity in our lives. But for the jackals and ostriches as well, it's because God gives drink to his people. And obviously, the ones who need to tell those praises the most are his people. That's their charge, to make God's glory known throughout the world. So, of course, to that extent, given that this is the essential message in the declaration that this month shall be unto you the beginning of months, that it shall be the first month of the year to you, this is the beginning of Israel fulfilling that mission, to tell God's praises. Well, of course, as you undoubtedly sense, this answer to our second question, which is, why is this the first commandment given to the emergent nation, is also an answer to our first question. Why is this, in Exodus chapter 11, verse 7, the high note of the crescendo of lessons to be learned from the plagues of Egypt, that you may know how God was the difference between the Egyptians and Israel. That is, the message that is to emerge thanks to the plagues of Egypt and the selection of Israel is precisely that message of God's presence in the world. It's not in order to glorify Israel. The glory doesn't belong to Israel. It is rather that by establishing this distinction, it establishes Israel's role as a source of light, of illumination. Not by any means implying any particular worthiness, but rather the role that God has designated. In other words, to restate this point, the plagues of Egypt are not intended to be merely a one-shot affair. A one-shot affair in which we see God manifest once upon a time over 3,000 years ago, and that's it. Rather, the essential role of the plagues of Egypt is to set the ball rolling, not just rolling, to set the ball accelerating, to establish a framework through which that message of God and godliness, the glorification of God and the glorification of godliness, will be communicated relentlessly in the world. Through whom? Through God's people. So the reason this progression of revealing God's presence and glory in the world culminates in that you will know how God distinguishes Israel is, again, not for the sake of Israel. It is, however, for the sake of the world. Now, of course, this is a critical starting point, but I already told you that I had 3 levels that I wanted to discuss with respect to this progression. So without any further ado, we move on to level number 2. We note that the focus of this commandment, this month shall be unto you the beginning of months, it shall be the first month of the year to you, pertains, of course, to time. And that inevitably should elicit a critically important association in us. After all, in what context did we, for the very first time, encounter holiness explicitly in the Torah, in the Bible? Where is holiness first invoked? The answer is in time. Genesis chapter 2. And the heaven and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the 7th day, God finished his work which he had made, and he rested, or ceased. We should note the verb that is translated as rested or ceased in the Hebrew is vayishvot, which comes from the same root as Shabbat, the Sabbath. So God ceased on the 7th day from all the work which he had made. And in verse 3, and God blessed the 7th day and hallowed it, sanctified it, made it holy, because in it he ceased from all his work that God created to do. The first place that holiness is explicitly invoked in the Torah is in the context of time. So, on that note, of course, the obvious association in this second level discussion of that first commandment is, first place that we saw holiness manifest in the world was in time. The first commandment given to Israel, which is essentially to infuse holiness, meaning significance, into the world, is also in time. But there's an additional dimension that we should critically bear in mind here, and that is, when we spoke of that first instance of holiness coming into the world, it was, of course, exclusively by divine agency. God sanctifies the Sabbath. The second place in Scripture in which we explicitly encounter the term holy is in Exodus chapter 3. Here, it is in the context of our reading about the story of the burning bush, that Moses was keeping the flock of Jethro and came to the mountain of God, to Horeb, and we read in chapter 3 of Exodus, verse 2, and the angel of God appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush, and he looked, and behold, the bush burned with fire, and the bush was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside now and see this great sight, why the bush is not burnt. And when God saw that he had turned aside to see, God called unto him out of the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses, and he said, here I am. And he said, draw not near to here. Put off your shoes from off your feet, for the place where you stand is holy ground. Second place that holy appears explicitly. Sanctification in the Torah. And of course, while in contrast to that initial sanctification of the Sabbath, that of course is in the realm of the divine and has nothing overtly to do with the realm of human beings at all, here there's a human being involved. That human being is Moses, but of course involved exclusively, passively. Involved reacting to the holiness that is established by God, but established exclusively by God. Just as the Sabbath is God sanctifying, so too the holy ground of the burning bush is sanctified by divine action, as it were, exclusively. It's interesting to note the next place in Scripture where we encounter explicitly the root of holiness is in Exodus chapter 13. And there's a critical difference here. Here, it is in the context of another commandment. In chapter 13, verse 1, and God spoke to Moses, saying, sanctify unto me all the firstborn. Whatsoever opens the womb among the children of Israel, both man and beast, is mine. That sanctification takes place in a particular manner, particular circumstances that are not presently the focus of our consideration. I merely want to focus on the realization that the verb for sanctifying, kadesh, is simply a conjugation of the self-same root of kodesh, as in holy ground, and likewise of what God did to the Sabbath, same root, vayikadesh. That God hallowed it, sanctified it. And of course, glaringly, the critical difference here is that the Sabbath and the ground of the burning bush were sanctified by God. And in Exodus chapter 13, this is a sanctification undertaken by man. That mandate by divine charge, what we might describe as imitatio Dei, emulating God, that just as God sanctified, he charges us to sanctify this world, to sanctify what we might otherwise construe as this mundane, recalcitrant world, to put holiness into it by dint of our efforts. Now, of course, consider that message of the first commandment given to the nation of Israel. That mandate to reckon the month of the Exodus as the first of months, to reckon time, to establish A cycle of the year is the critical prerequisite of our sanctifying time, which indeed is a crucial dimension of the charge that God gives us. This is a subject to which the Torah returns in far greater detail, in particular in Leviticus chapter 23. It is admittedly one of several passages in the Torah that discusses the holy days of the cycle of the year. Conspicuously, Leviticus chapter 23 is the first passage in the Torah that presents explicitly and in great detail every one of the holy days of the cycle of the year. And what is especially glaring and illuminating in what we read in Leviticus chapter 23 is the role that we need to play. 3 times in the chapter. In verse 2, the appointed seasons of God, which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations, in verse 2. And again, in verse 4, these are the appointed seasons of God, even the holy convocations, which you shall proclaim. And then we get a very detailed presentation of those appointed seasons, those holy convocations that you are to proclaim. And there's a kind of postscript summation in verse 37. Once again, these are the appointed seasons of God, which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations. You need to proclaim them. It's your responsibility. It's your charge. This is the mandate that God imposes upon man. God establishes holiness at the outset, but then he charges us to continue the effort. And there's another additional dimension that is more subtle here, but I think it's critically important for us to emphasize when we consider the emergent message from Leviticus chapter 23. And that is, in describing all of the holy days of the year, of course, not surprisingly, the Torah's list begins with the most sacred of those days of all. What's the most sacred day of all of the holy days of the Torah? Of course, the answer is the one that comes every 7 days, the Sabbath. And in verse 3, we read, 6 days shall work be done, but on the 7th is a Sabbath of solemn rest, a holy convocation. You shall do no manner of work. It is a Sabbath unto God in all your dwellings. And of course, here too, we encounter the expression, a holy convocation. But there is, of course, a critical, glaring difference. In verse 2, you shall proclaim the appointed seasons to be holy convocations. Same thing in verse 4, you shall proclaim. And again, in verse 37, you shall proclaim. And you know, there is a fairly glaring specific emphasis when you continue on to verse 38. These appointed seasons are beside the Sabbaths of God. Because the Sabbaths of God are indeed, on the one hand, a holy convocation, but not a holy convocation that you are charged to proclaim. Why not? Of course, if you think about it, the answer is fairly self-evident. God sanctified the Sabbath. God sanctified the Sabbath, and by dint of that sanctification, every 7th day is a holy Sabbath unto God. And there is no further effort necessary on our part. We don't sanctify the Sabbath. We allow the sanctity of the Sabbath to enter our lives. But the sanctity of the Sabbath will be there whether we recognize it or not. And moreover, there is no further effort required for us to become aware of that sanctity, other than recognizing that God is the source of the sanctity, and then we just have to count up to 7. Every 7th day is the Sabbath. The sanctity of the Sabbath was established by God at the outset, and it continues without fail, without variance, every 7th day. As opposed to the sanctity of the holy days. First of all, as we already noted, the holy days inevitably depend upon a calendar. Well, upon what basis is that calendar to be drawn? Inevitably, the answer is you need to determine what the calendar is. You need to determine that sequence of the holy days. That's your responsibility. That's something that is inevitably the charge that is imposed upon man. And that, of course, necessarily is critical. That is, as opposed to the sanctity of the Sabbath that comes exclusively from God, the sanctity of the holy days is something over which you exercise a critical role. And if you ask, upon what basis is that critical role established? This is it, folks. This month shall be unto you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you. That is, again, in our ancient tradition, this is a charge not merely to declare one month, the first of the months of the year, but to sanctify the beginning of that month and of all the months. To establish the calendar that allows the sanctity of time to descend into this world on days other than the Sabbath. And of course, that then becomes the critical difference between the days that you proclaim to be holy convocations and a day that is by itself a holy convocation, even if you haven't done a single thing. Returning again to the high note of the crescendo of Exodus chapter 11, verse 7. Remember, it's a progression about the glory of God. Why is the distinction of Israel figuring as the final note in this progression? Because in order for us to discern the glory of God in the world, we need to be proactive. Of course, by our being proactive, we're not barging into the driver's seat and driving away on our own. On the contrary, we are hearkening to the divine charge that commands us to get into the driver's seat. God tells us to proclaim these days. God then, at the outset, first commandment to Israel, tells us you need to be proactive in bringing holiness into the world. And that's the reason that the culmination of the plagues is establishing this distinction. Because it's your charge to make this world a more holy and more godly place. First commandment given to the nation. That, again, was level number 2. But I said we have 3 levels. There's one additional factor that I feel we need to append to what we've stated thus far. and it is arguably the most sublime. But I think it's a critical addendum to what we have stated thus far. You know, with respect to the sequence of the holy days, and indeed that mandate to establish the sanctity of time, there is a glaring anomaly to which we have had occasion to make reference in the past as well. And that is, on the one hand, again, Exodus chapter 12, verse 2 explicitly states that this month is to be the beginning of the months of the year. Which month? Well, that was pretty obvious. That was the month of the Exodus. The month that likewise is described in Exodus chapter 23. That is, we read here of the celebration of Passover, the feast of unleavened bread, in verse 15. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, as I commanded you, at the time appointed in the month of spring. For in it you came out of Egypt. This is the celebration of Passover, and it is, as we read explicitly in Exodus chapter 12, verse 2, the first month of the year. Well, that means that the month of Passover is the first month of the year. So the year begins then in the month of Passover, right? Not exactly. A year begins in the month of Passover. But in the very next verse, in Exodus chapter 23, verse 16, we read, the feast of harvest, the first fruits of your labors, which you sow in the field, and the feast of ingathering at the end of the year, when you gather in your labors out of the field. Now, what becomes very clear in context is this feast of ingathering, Feast of Tabernacles, of which we read at much greater length in Leviticus chapter 23, but we don't have time to discuss that right now. That holy day takes place in the 7th month, reckoning from the month of the Exodus. In other words, it's half a year around. You can describe it either as half a year before or half a year after the month of the Exodus. The polar opposite in the cycle of the year. And I'm stressing this point because, of course, in as much as the Torah describes that festival as taking place at the end of the year, and in as much as we all recognize that when you get to the end of the year, you don't fall off the edge. Rather, at the end of the year, another year begins. By implication, then, there is a year that begins in the 7th month. Now, we've discussed this previously. This, of course, is the reason that we refer to the holy day that takes place on the first day of the 7th month as Rosh Hashanah, the new year. Because there is a year that begins in the 7th month, as manifest, ironically, by the Torah describing the year as ending then, and our deducing from the fact that the year ends then, that it also begins then. Interesting, isn't it, that we find explicitly in the Torah 2 new years, 6 months apart from one another. Wherein lies the difference between them? Well, recall again the new year that is described as taking place in the month of the Exodus, Exodus chapter 12, is described as the beginning of months, the first month of the year to you, which is why indeed the holy days of the 7th month may include Rosh Hashanah, what we call the beginning of the year, but it's still the 7th month. That is, the new year of months starts in the month of the Exodus. Whereas the context in which we encounter the new year, described as the end of the year, in Exodus chapter 23, is as part of the agricultural cycle, the Feast of Ingathering, of course pertaining to the ingathering of the produce that has been left out in the field in our blessed Mediterranean climate in the land of Israel, in which during the summer months there is no rain, and as a result the grain is left out to dry in the fields, and before the rainy season begins, you bring all of the grain into your silos and whatever other structures you have to keep it dry once the rains begin. Now again, I stress, this pertains to the agricultural year. The agricultural year, manifestly, depends not on months, but rather the cycle of the year that is based upon the sun. When we reckon months, months have nothing to do with the cycle of the year and the Earth's revolution around the sun. Months, as indeed is obvious from the root of the word month, derived from the moon. So, in that vein, we have one new year, of which we read in Exodus chapter 12, that depends upon the months, the moon. And another new year, 6 months away, that is the new year that depends upon the sun. What conceptually distinguishes these two new years? We are all familiar with the words of Ecclesiastes, famous words in chapter 1, verse 9. That which has been is that which will be, that which has been done is that which will be done, and there is nothing new under the sun. Under the sun, there is nothing new. The sun symbolizes what is static, what is unchanging. The cycle of the sun strikes us as that which repeats over and over and over again endlessly. I can't help but note, but in Hebrew, the word for year, which again is that unit of time that's based upon the sun, is shana, coming from the root of lishanen, to repeat over and over again, statically. The sun, from our perspective, doesn't change. Oh yes, but the moon does. The moon is always changing. Every night when we look at the moon, it's in a different position and a different phase. The moon is always in flux. The moon, then, symbolizes dynamism, change, movement, initiative. Consider these two new years. The new year that's based upon the sun is the new year that is described not in terms of newness, but rather ironically in terms of the end of the year, when the year ends. The new year that pertains to the moon, however, is indeed all about newness. First of all, it's the month of the Exodus, when you became new, when you emerged from bondage and became a new nation. Second, it's significant to note that while in the Torah, generally speaking, we do not find names for the months of the year, they are merely referred to by number, this month has a name. In the Hebrew, it's called Chodesh HaAviv, and indeed, in our classic translation, Aviv is left merely transliterated, but that means the month of spring. The month of spring, when everything is new, when everything is blossoming, when everything is bursting forth. The month of spring signifies that dynamism, signifies that initiative. And indeed, in that vein, we should well appreciate that, returning to Exodus chapter 13, the emphasis, this day you go forth in the month of spring. Your exodus, like the botanical world around you, is all about newness, all about blossoming, all about dynamism. And it is precisely in this recurrent manner that we read repeatedly that the Feast of Unleavened Bread is at the time appointed in the month of spring. And in Exodus chapter 34, once again, that the Feast of Unleavened Bread, Passover, is at the time appointed in the month of spring. For in the month of spring you came out of Egypt. And finally, in Deuteronomy chapter 16, observe the month of spring and keep Passover. The only contexts in which we encounter that name, the month of spring, are pertaining to the Passover and the Exodus. And of course, inevitably, this is our level 3. The commandment with which Israel embarks upon its mission is, of course, level number 1, a commandment that bids us to tell the praises of God and make God and godliness known throughout the world. But more than that, level number 2, it is to engender holiness, to proactively follow in God's footsteps in bringing holiness into the world. And more than that too, level number 3. Level number 3 is appreciating that in our doing just that, what we are summoned to do is to take initiative. What we're summoned to do is resonate not so much with the static aspect that is symbolized by the sun. That has its role. But the first commandment is about being dynamic. The first commandment is get out there and get to work. The first commandment is resonate with the moon. To always be moving, growing, going, dynamically bringing sanctity, bringing godliness into the world. And that, inevitably, brings us back to Exodus chapter 11, verse 7, and the high note of the crescendo of the plagues. Indeed, it's not enough merely to recount God's dominion in some kind of a general or abstracted manner, as a kind of fossilized carryover from something that happened over 3,000 years ago. No. The culmination of the plagues is to distinguish that nation that is then charged with continuing to bring God into the world, continuing to tell God's praises, but not only that, continuing to bring holiness into the world. Not only that, continuing dynamically, taking the initiative as God charges us. But he has, as it were, passed the ball to us. We need to run with it. We need, indeed, to proactively bring the message of God and godliness into the world. By so doing, we bring the purpose of all the plagues to its intended, divinely ordained culmination. May we indeed be faithful to this mandate. God bless you.